Welcome to those who are here for day 2 and who've just arrived. It's great to see you all. I'm very pleased to introduce Dr. Josephine McMurray from Wilfrid Laurier Brantford campus in Ontario. And also, and I probably shouldn't say this and Josephine might kill me later, but Josephine's just been tenured to Associate Professor and that will become official in the summer. So it's great that she's just had this promotion. So Josephine's going to be talking about the business of aging and ecosystems. So straight after this, we've got lunch. Don't worry if there's conversation, questions. There'll be plenty of time to carry that on. Thank you.
Thanks, Hannah. Thank you so much for inviting me here to talk about my research, and I really appreciate yours and the committee's confidence in my ability to be able to speak for an hour. So I'm delighted to be able to use this time today to add my voice to the growing number of academics, practitioners, and futurists who's talking about the impact of population aging. I'd like to change the conversation a little bit today and speak, first of all, by framing the problem or the issues a little differently, why aging is important to us. Secondly, how we're in this incredible naturalistic experiment at the moment where digitization of health and confidence in our ability to be able to digitize activities has received a lot of faith. So increasingly, we are looking to technology to help us with some of these big, hairy 21st century challenges. And so what I'm going to do is I'll frame it today a little bit. I'll talk a little bit about age-related technology as a solution. I want to then get into, in a fairly informal way, talking about one of the research projects that we have going on. And if I have time, I'll speak about a couple of the others as well that are related to this ecosystem approach to helping innovators and entrepreneurs to be able to develop these technologies for those big 21st century challenges like aging. Then afterwards, hopefully, we'll have a little bit of time. I have no doubt that I won't be able to fill my hour time, so we'll hopefully have an opportunity to have some discussion. And this research, obviously, I'd like to acknowledge the folks who are contributing to it. I'm part of the AGEWELL National Centers of Excellence, and this work is supported by SSHRC as well. So I'm here with a very talented undergraduate student of mine, Shreya Shah, who's going to be giving a talk in the afternoon about a little part of the project as well. And she had noted the other day that when she was talking with people, people said, "Are you American?" And when she said no, the Canadian thing is people weren't as comfortable with it. So I thought I'll add a couple of slides in here to put some context on Canada. So Canada is this incredibly sparsely populated country. It's the 9th most sparsely populated country in the world. And we tend to agglomerate all along this 100 miles between the Canadian and US border. So that's where actually 90% of our population lives. And so you'd think that technology would rank pretty high if you have a lot of geographic remoteness in a country. And it does kinda, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. As far as our economy goes, and I apologize, while my PhD is in public health and health systems, I have an MBA. So I have this kind of businessy background, and I actually am in the faculty of business at Laurier. So there's going to be creeping into this, for some people, interestingly, for other people, reluctantly, this issue of sort of value generation and how we sustain what we're doing as innovators and entrepreneurs in this digital health space. So when I talk here about a branch plant economy, what's happening in Canada is not what's really happening in the UK or the US, is that we tend not to have big, successful anchor companies. And the ones that we do have usually tend to mess up big. And you can take RIM as an example of that. So we tend to have a location where we have big anchor companies come and we present them with a great environment for building their companies, but oftentimes they're foreign owned. As far as how much money we spend on business R&D, that's the bird, we're about 15th in the world. We're 9th on innovation performance. So interestingly enough, as an economy, we're doing well as far as being innovative, but we're sort of hitting above our weight as far as how much money is actually being invested in innovation and technology in Canada. And as far as what we're able to do, unfortunately, the investment in R&D tends to come from a very small number of companies. So that's Canada. And a little bit about Waterloo. If you haven't heard about it, I actually live in Waterloo, and this Waterloo region is actually just made up of about 500,000 people. We're about 90 kilometers southwest of Toronto, and this Toronto-Waterloo, Canada corridor is second only to Silicon Valley in the number of technology workers and companies that we have. So it's a really important part of what we do and how we sustain how we live and our quality of life. At the end of this corridor is this Waterloo region, which is the third largest tech cluster in Canada after Toronto and Montreal. We have a couple of degree-granting colleges, 3 universities, the University of Waterloo, of which pumps out about 1,800 computing science students each year and about 2,000 engineering students. Interestingly enough, we have 150 research institutes in the region. And I'm mentioning this for a reason, as we'll get to in a moment. We have the Waterloo Institute for Nanotechnology, the Institute for Quantum Computing, the Center for International Governance Innovation, the Lazaridis Institute for Management of Technology Enterprises, and this is the Perimeter Institute, where our claim to fame was in 2010. Stephen Hawking spent 6 weeks here in the summer, and we regularly have and sustain some of the most talented physicists and scientists around the world, all sustained by grants from Mike Lazaridis, who and the Canadian government, he was one of the founders of RIM, and he has been an incredible philanthropist in the region. So when I start to talk about regional innovation ecosystems, your ability to be able to create successful entrepreneurs who are embedded and really connected to your communities provides people like us, researchers, developers, innovators, to be able to do our work in infrastructure and in a culture and a supportive environment that helps us move from the we've got a great idea through to let's try and commercialize it, or let's try and get it implemented in a public system. So that's the importance of having a really vibrant ecosystem around you. We tend not to be able, we look for proxies to try and measure, how innovative are systems. And we usually end up here. It's not a really good proxy for how innovative your region might be, but usually we try and measure patents and patents per capita. Interestingly enough, in Waterloo, we hold 14.5% of Canada's patents, and it's growing. And remember, this is a region that just has 500,000 people. It's tiny, and that's a region made up of 3 small communities. So size doesn't necessarily matter when it comes to your regional innovation system. So the other thing that we have is this really rich history of innovation. And culturally, if you look at any of the really successful innovation ecosystems around the world, you'll see that there has been this culture of innovation that goes way back. And ours started with a Mennonite population that arrived back at the turn of the century, a very sort of isolated group of people, but they were can-do people. So they are part of our community. Our very high-tech community has horse ties and buggy trails because the Mennonite community are all embedded. They go to the same grocery stores, but they travel instead by car, by horse and buggy. So rich history of innovation. We were the biggest tannery. We had some of the most innovative tanneries, et cetera. So that history of innovation is really important. And when you look at, for instance, Silicon Valley, when you look at Cambridge and Boston, that history of innovation goes far back. Really important for building the kind of ecosystems that allows us to play. So True to every other hack researcher in this domain, I'm going to start the conversation with this ubiquitous hockey stick curve that is our aging population. These are UN 2015 figures, and that showing an increase of 48% of people over 60 in 2000, and by 2030 that number will grow by 56% to 1.4 billion. By 2050, the global population of older persons will double its size, reaching nearly 2 billion. I'd like to move it to a slightly different place and talk about how we change the conversation by helping business leaders, entrepreneurs, and innovators like yourself understand what I think is actually one of the most misunderstood markets, which is our aging population. There it goes. Okay, so without stating the obvious, the issues of aging represent some of the most profound, one of the most profound and guaranteed shifts in our economy. In Canada, what this means is that the percentage of Canadians over 65 in 2030 will grow to about 1 in 4. And this figure is very similar to here in the UK, depending on your local authority or where you are, which ranges anywhere from 6 to 33% of people who will be over 65. So this is a really big issue. What's happening? We know what's happening on an intellectual level. We have better medical care. We have improved living conditions. We have less infectious diseases, and they're all helping to create this better quality of life for many of our folks. But what isn't changing so much is how we think about aging. And ageism has been shown to have significant impact on our participation in society, our health, and how long we live. So, for example, evidence shows that those folks who hold negative views on aging recover slower from surgery. They live less, 7.5 years less. They are less likely to be socially integrated. So this ageism can really impact on people's quality of lives. And we know that thinking about, that living with ageism can really impact on your life. So it also, more importantly, changes and influences policy. It imposes barriers on how we think and how problems are framed. It influences the questions we ask, the solutions that are offered, and so often it's presented as a justification for treating people unequally and limiting their opportunities for meaningful contribution. Ageism is likely one of the only isms that is socially acceptable and largely unchallenged because it is a social construct. But because it is a social construct, age is not also just about your physical health. It's affected by a variety of other factors. By the way, this is Ernestine Shepherd, and she is 80, and she is the world's oldest female bodybuilder. She and I share the same birth date, so not the same bodybuilding acumen. So I have a particular connection to her joie de vivre. But as a social construction, it also means that we are able to change that. The fact is that Ernestine is not alone. Her cohort of people over 18 is growing much faster than others. In upper to middle economies like India and China, and high-income countries like the UK and Canada, they will account for about 40% of the 80 and over population in 2050. Low-income countries will see an 81% increase in the number of the oldest old persons between 2015 and 2030 because of what we've been able to do with infectious diseases. But more importantly, 80% of the world's population over 80 will live in those middle to low-income countries. So when we're thinking about our technological approaches to helping people to age and age independently, we oftentimes have to look beyond what we're doing here and think about the bottom of the pyramid, some of those low-tech responses that are going to help people age independently and for economies not to collapse under the burden of aging adults. This increase is occurring, obviously, to rising health, nutrition, and sanitation in those developing countries, and it's leading to greater longevity. what's interesting at the same time, if you think about it, is that we have a declining percentage of people under 24. In the UK in particular, that population has declined from 24.5% in '76 to about 18% in 2016, and this proportion is going to decline even further in the future years. So these are the healthcare workers. These are the taxpayers. These are the innovators and entrepreneurs of 2020 and beyond, and there are fewer of them. So we have to think about that in this whole challenge of an aging population. The other elephant in the room is that most people are pretty healthy throughout their lives. That's touch wood for all of us, but the costs of care rise after the age of 60, and they rise significantly after the age of 80. And as we talked about before, those over 80-year-olds are the ones who experience the most healthcare challenges, and they are the most expensive. So the final influencer that I'm going to talk about today is poverty in older adults. And this data is challenged a little bit by the absence of international harmonized databases on poverty, and also with confounding factors associated with rurality, but we can still extract some insights from the data that's available. For low-income countries, older adults tend to be poorer than the rest of the population. In middle income, they're approximately the same, and in high-income countries like the UK and Canada, there are fewer adults older adults living in poverty. In fact, in the US, the American Association for Retired Persons estimates that those over 50 have about 85% of the US household wealth. So older adults in middle and low-income countries spend less than average than those in high-income countries who spend more. So in summary, we have the problem framed now, or the challenge framed. We have a growing number of people over 60 in high-income countries. We have exponential growth of those over 60 in low income, and those who are over 80 are growing. So we have exponential costs of delivering care, a shrinking percentage of the population of people who are working to both support the tax base and provide care for older family members, and or supplying us with caring professions. So this is clearly not a hypothetical problem. Most governments and industries, however, despite this problem and challenge being framed for the last sort of 10 to 20 years for many of the folks who have been in the industry, most governments and industry are not prepared for the economic impact of these challenges. But there's some really interesting work that's going on at the moment, and that is that despite all of these challenges, there is some consensus that where the population is rapidly aging, in fact, your economy can grow. With lower fertility rates, you see rising investments in the amount of resources available to each child, and so therefore you see an increase in the capacity that they have to lead more productive lives. Children also tend to become more educated and trend towards knowledge economies, higher paying jobs. There's also greater familial transfers of wealth and greater participation of females in the workforce with fewer children. And of course, with rising education and economic prosperity and fewer people in the labor force, those who are generally commanding higher wages will stay in the workforce for longer. So all of these components are kind of counterbalancing this challenge that we have of fewer people being in the workforce, is that there is this pull to keep people in the workforce longer, and this potentiality around this longevity economy. So how do we bend that healthcare cost? That healthcare cost curve. The fact remains that as we age, we are faced with these rising healthcare costs and social care costs, and it is not a popular thing for politicians to have to go out and talk about rising costs of healthcare per capita in comparison to GDP. Most of them do not like that, and I think UK at the moment is around about 10%, and Canada is somewhere around about 11 or 12%. And as soon as that starts getting higher, it becomes kind of unacceptable for people. And as much as they may want healthcare and the services that they need when they want them, they don't like to see it on their tax bill. So At this point, what we're trying to do is look for ways to bend that healthcare cost curve. And of course now, as you're all part of this, we're looking to technology. And I refer to this in sort of this big aggregate as labor-saving technology, and it's a catch-all phrase, but it includes things like innovative age-related medical equipment and hardware, services, consumer technologies, processes, software applications, and marketing. So all of this is intended to be able to extend our capacity to be able to deliver care. There's also this solution that we talked about, what's been referred to by the EU as the silver economy, or Coughlin at MIT refers to it as the longevity economy. And what this is the expansion of consumption for consumers being longer as you age. So oftentimes we look at it and think, sort of once you're past 60, really consumption stops. But in fact, that's not the case because of this huge transfer as well. So in fact, we've almost created this new and additional category of population. We know that the spending power of boomers in the middle to high income countries will reach about 15 trillion by 2020. And they're interested in spending their money on a number of things. Travel and leisure activities, yes, but increasingly they're interested in ensuring that they're able to live and age independently in a place of their choosing. And that includes purchases of things like healthcare services and technologies. Interestingly enough, though, we as researchers who have innovative technologies and digital goods and services, some industries in general, and certainly investors, entrepreneurs, and their mentors will run the other way when you mention healthcare, and anything related to aging. And some of that has to do with their lack of understanding about this increase in capacity for spending power. Because of course, when people come into, as an investor, come into the area, and I'll talk about this in a moment, they are looking for returns. The other thing that healthcare has, which, and I just sort of thought I'd run through a little bit of the obvious, you all know these, this overabundance of conservatism around security and privacy regulations. And I popped this up there. This was actually a recent email that I got from the hospital. I sit on a hospital board locally. And the hospital sent out this email that said, increasingly we've got this dynamic cybersecurity environment, stringent legislation, current privacy and information standards means that we are no longer able to send you emails over your laptop. And so you have volunteer board members who now are going to have to carry 2 separate laptops in order to be able to get the governance, the materials that they need to be able to do their job. So overabundance of concern around privacy and security, clearly that's the case, but there's a paradox in that if you go on to patient portals like Patients Like Me, you'll see that many patients are sharing intimate details of their life in order to be able to get well. So we have these paradoxes in healthcare that sort of like one foot on the accelerator and one foot on the brake at the same time. Another one of the interesting little paradoxes is that investors really don't know the domain. This is from an interview that I did with a Cambridge, UK angel investor. And he said, why is health and aging stuff difficult? Well, investors tend to fit quite nicely along established investor norm models. And basically that means is, as an investor, an angel investor, you like to come in 3 to 5 years maximum. Your return on investment has to be about 30 to 40%. Most of them have absolutely no knowledge of what's going on in the healthcare domain. And it's not a crowded space. Interestingly enough, that's terrifying for investors. They like a crowd. They're goats. They like to go where there's just a small crowd, not too big, so that there is still lots of opportunities there, but they like to be able to look around and see their own kind. So in healthcare, that is oftentimes just crickets. There aren't people who are coming in the kind of numbers that go to other industries. So investors don't understand this domain, and we have to think of ways of how we bring them in and pull them along with us so that they are feeling more comfortable. There is minimal interoperability, and I actually, this is a quote from an MD off a listserv from AMIA, the American Medical Informatics Association that I'm on, and where this genius guy, it's a very small snippet of the conversation, but he was talking about workflow interoperabilities between healthcare organizations, and I found it really ironic because workflow interoperability is way down the line. So often we can't even get how do we share information, and when we share information, it's interpreted at the other organization in the same way that we interpret it at our organization. So we're way back here, but still we're trying to think about how do we actually integrate organizations and make them more interoperable, not just at the technical level but at the workflow level. And for most of you who are developing digital technology in this domain, oftentimes the trouble that we have is that we think always about the technology. We think about the technical requirements and components. We oftentimes don't think about the workflows and the implementation. And the implementation is what will sustain that technology and ultimately build a business model. So if you're looking to, as a developer or as an entrepreneur, to actually make a living and put your kids through school from this work, you have to be able to think about how it's going to be implemented and sustained, rather than just as a pilot project. So that minimal interoperability can be really difficult. And it oftentimes means as well that you have walled gardens. So I think if we're thinking just about digital health information systems in the healthcare and hospital sector, I think worldwide the biggest still is McKesson, which is interesting because they're sort of exiting from many markets. But is Meditech. McKesson is exiting from some markets. There's Epic, Cerner. Many of those don't speak together. So if you have a Cerner system and you decide you want to move to Epic, it is such an incredibly difficult process. It's very difficult as well to take a best of breeds approach and say, I'll take this module from here and this module from here so that we can build a bespoke system that's really good for us as users. And it's just not possible. And it's not possible because still we're constrained in this market by small markets. Particularly if you're in a public healthcare system. So again, another little anomaly in the healthcare system. And the other is this developer-entrepreneur dystopia that I talk about. And the normal developer in the tech sector is not of the aged population. There is usually a substantial gap between what is developed and what is actually needed within the market. So part of our challenge is to be able to bring those two groups together to be able to develop tools that are not only useful, but they are sustainable and workable, and people want them. So another little issue with healthcare. And the final one that I want to talk about is just ageism and this abandonment of technology. And we have the societal challenge of aging, of ageism can be resisted through opportunities for face-to-face interactions. And so trying to promote these social relationships are really important. So what most developers would find if they went and talked to some of their potential users is not Luddites, but they'd find this very heterogeneous population of potential users with needs and priorities that are very different from other generations. It was really interesting. I was at the Keynote yesterday and was fascinated by the number of similarities between the older adult population and the needs for technology and younger people. Younger people need navigators and people to talk to about their technology. And they talked yesterday about turning to parents when it came to health. Older adults need exactly the same thing. Young people are very heterogeneous. They're not just all digital natives. Some of them are quite different. And same with older adults as well. They're quite different. They use technologies differently. And unfortunately, they oftentimes don't get what they need. How many of you have got older parents that are still living? Okay, great. And how many of them have hearing problems? All right. How many of them use assistive technology for their hearing problem? Fewer. Yeah. My mom has a pair of $5,000 hearing aids that sit on her bedside table, and we use the analog technology of yelling at her to communicate. And it's because they don't wear well, she feels it stigmatizes her, it's uncomfortable, and it doesn't sound right. So we've got these incredible technologies that people are abandoning because they're not built for them. So a little bit of sort of businessy stuff here. So what we need to be able to do is not to be able to build devices in the hope that older adults will come. What's required is the creation of a pull effect. So instead of constantly pushing these technologies out and hoping that people will come to them, we need to be able to develop novel products and services that suit the population, their care providers, and health system providers, and products and services that support independence and aging in place. And that would include things like technology assistive devices, robotics that incorporate artificial intelligence, software for care coordination and data analysis, and smart technologies that are associated with homes, communities, and service delivery. So that's my framing of the issue. And now I want to just talk a little bit about the DRIVE project. My colleague, Dr. Heidi Sviestrup, is actually a lab rat. She has a multi-million-dollar motion sensor lab at the University of Ottawa. And we have, with our very talented postdoctoral student, Dr. Heather McNeil, have been working on something called DRIVE, the Development of Regional Health Innovation Ecosystems. And what we're trying to do is to understand how regional ecosystems contribute to the creation of this fertile environment for health and aging technology innovation, and from conceptualization right through to commercialization or implementation. This work is part of AGEWELL, which is an acronym for Aging Gracefully Across Environments Using Technology to Support Wellness, Engagement, and Long Life. And this is a National Center of Excellence in Canada. It was funded in 2015. We're just heading into our third year of funding. And there are 33 universities who are involved. We have probably about 50 researchers, all of whom were involved with the creation of this NCE, and we were awarded $36.6 million. I am not spending that amount of money on my project. It has been used over the 5 years to actually create these innovation hubs and novel technologies. So a little bit about our methods and where we've been. So we started out by doing some scoping reviews in the first year, looking at regional innovation systems generally. And there is a very broad and rich literature on innovation systems and how and why they do or don't work. So we went there looking for anything related to health, and it's very, very, very sparse. And it's even more sparse when it gets to aging. We then went off and did 4 international case studies, which I'll talk about very briefly. In years 2 and 3, we've just finished those. And we're in the process of developing these models, and I'll talk about that just briefly today. We then have been involved with the development of an innovation hub associated with Dr. Sviestrup's innovation lab. We've actually created this new little incubator that we're hoping to be able to monitor and assess developmentally over the next couple of years to see its progress, some of our learnings, whether or not they come to fruition. And then what we're hoping to do is develop these guidelines in year 4 and 5. And we've already started to sort of develop some higher level KT, knowledge translation tools for people. So we started out in these case studies by doing 92 semi-structured interviews with people from Copenhagen, Surrey, Boston, and Cambridge. The interviews were all transcribed verbatim, and and then we analyzed those and the supplementary documents that we collected, over 200 of them, to actually look for themes using directed and emergent coding. So before I get into some of what, and I'm just going to cover off some of our findings at a very high level, just back to this idea of what an innovation ecosystem is. It came out of some of the early work in biological ecosystems where people talked about these living systems that have a life stage that tend to evolve. And that actually fits kind of nicely with how regions, cities start to think about themselves as innovative, places where people can come to develop new and innovative technologies and to be able to apply them to improve people's lives, and not necessarily just in the health space. So they're very dynamic, very interactive, and they also have very strong roots in industry and business, which shouldn't turn you off necessarily, because the partnership with business and industry is oftentimes fraught with difficulties for researchers and developers, but more and more there are incentives for business to be involved and to park some of their prejudices and biases at the door when they come into these systems. These innovation systems teams tend to be very hierarchical, so there are bodies of entities that happen in these ecosystems. So you'll have this regional ecosystem that might be part of a big national ecosystem, and then you'll have within there things like living labs, innovation hubs, accelerators, incubators. So all of those are part of the same dynamic group of entities that help people to both to start to develop and then to move their technologies through the system. We started to play with some of these models. This was adapted from Karianis and Ladersdorf, and that's where you think about these helices, civic society, education systems, economic systems, political systems, and then the natural built environment, and how they all come together to be able to weave this network, this kind of complex interaction of systems and local actors that make up these innovation systems. And of course, when you start to think about health and aging, it's natural to say, well, while the large proportion of people's aging and health-related activity happens in the community. It doesn't happen in the healthcare system. It happens as we find adequate housing, as we find nutritious food. All of those things are really important. But we have to weave into this the healthcare system and the social care system as well. So we started to adjust our model accordingly. But we started with that, and then we went out and we did these 4 case studies. One in Surrey, BC, which had started out in this kind of early stage. They had no history of innovation in the community, a lot of economic difficulties, but a very charismatic and determined mayor who brought together a whole pile of people from industry, universities and researchers, from government, and from the community and the healthcare system to start talking about how they can actually build an innovation system that is helping people to age more appropriately in their region. We went to the Capital Health Region in Denmark. Once again, a really rich history of health innovation, but still very early stage. Cambridge is mature. They have this big underlying sort of a green system of innovation, but they've got no real history other than outside of biomed and life sciences of kind of healthcare innovation. And then Boston in the United States, which is very purposefully also, by the way, a sort of a greenfield innovation system, but very mature. But they are now planning to be an aging innovation system. They are coordinating their government activities and a whole pile of other opportunities to be able to build that out. So this is the model that we have started to build out, and I'll just run through it. So we've got those helices that I talked about before. We've got all of the ecosystem that goes along with government, with industry, with research and universities. We added in the healthcare system, and then also the civic society. And we within the healthcare system, it's so important to have co-creation, and that's been a really important part, that public engagement and bringing people into the system to have control over what actually happens on their behalf. So co-creation is not something that innovation systems tend to talk about generally, but in health, it's absolutely critical. And that co-creation, particularly with aging, is fraught with difficulty because of the issues that older adults have, and because of their slow exit from society oftentimes. So within this milieu, then, you have to bring this knowledge, these ideas, really strong policy instruments, regulations, resources that are absolutely focused on building these kind of technologies. Infrastructure. So for instance, if you're trying to build assistive technologies, you need small manufacturing, and you need manufacturing labs within your city so that people who are developing new tools can actually go there. They usually can't access those facilities on a large scale. You oftentimes need to be able to, as well, have an infrastructure that has good social capital. And what that means in Waterloo is that we have built an environment that is attractive for young people, and that comes with just having 2 very big universities in the community. But we also have turned it into a walkable city. We try and make sure that there is affordable housing for younger people, because it's young developers and their families who come to our area. It is incredibly multicultural, so we are very agnostic around where people come from in Waterloo. So very rich cultures that are not necessarily assimilated into the community. It's very much a multicultural city. We try and build out these networks, and networks are so critical. In Cambridge, one of the things that we found is absolutely fascinating, is that in talking with new entrepreneurs coming into the community, they talked about how hard it was to get into the network. But once they were in the network, it was like they had come home. There were people who were willing to support them, mentors, coaches, investors were more available to them. So those networks and these sort of beneficial proximities of having people in the same space is really important. So in Waterloo and in Cambridge and other places that have been successful in developing really innovative communities, you'll find that they just let, what Cambridge says, 100 flowers bloom. They don't try and control what's happening. They just encourage and create an infrastructure that allows people to develop. And so we have numerous incubators around the city. We have one big innovation hub called Communitech, which has been going for 13 to 15 years now. Very successful. They run about 900 new ventures out of that they're carrying at any one time, which again is pretty dramatic for a city that's of 500,000 people. The other thing that we think is really different in the health innovation systems is this building capacity in people. All of these things, all of these systems are really important, but ultimately it's the co-creation of capital, of human capital, which is actually the most important thing. That allows people to skill up, and not just people who are from engineering and computing science. One of the things, and I'll talk, if I have time, a little bit about a small project that we have going on around trying to focus on healthcare workers, oftentimes 80% women in healthcare professions, and yet so many of them are not seeing themselves as innovators, nor do they consider it. Now, that makes sense in that they've probably gone into healthcare because they want to be carers, but so many of them are also innovators. They call them workarounds, but they are innovators. And so how do we create that really innovative professional approach within the health domain? Part of that is enabling our healthcare workers as well. And so that then creates this virtual feedback system where you're building the infrastructure, creating the capacity, and ultimately hopefully encouraging people to get into the aging and healthcare technology domain. This is a little text heavy, and I apologize for this, but I just wanted to sort of talk to you about some of the issues that we have been building into and trying to address with our model. the fact that public procurement is really a problem in most places. Oftentimes, government health departments, when they're looking to buy something new, they'll want to go to vendors that they can trust, that have been around for a long time. They want to make sure that they have the financial capacity to be in business over the next 5 years. And they want to be able to provide with good value, oftentimes with reference customers. Well, that's completely antithetical to new and innovative young companies. And so that can be really difficult. So we've talked about this idea of, how do we find solutions to this? Building anchor companies that are interested in investing into market strategies with small independent developers. So you've got the anchor companies who are actually working with small developers. Focus pilot schemes that are actually focusing on development, assessment, and implementation. Not just, well, we've got this really new technology and we want to try it out. That's not good enough any longer. You've got to be able to build out and stage how you're going to scale up your technology right from the very start. And sometimes that includes going outside and thinking globally right from the very start of starting your development of your technology. And then as well, trying to coordinate intergovernmental policy. You have national policies, you have sometimes state or province level strategies, policies, and then municipal policies, none of which oftentimes work together to be able to encourage people to be able to come together to help young companies get a foot in the door when you're trying to build health technologies. This is a biggie, this disengagement of older adults when you're talking about age-related technologies. And Heather McNeil, our postdoc, did a wonderful project where she actually interviewed through focus groups and in-depth interviews about 60 older adults, stakeholders from government, the industry and researchers to ask about this engagement of older adults. And it's nasty down at the bottom, but it does actually show you some of the issues that she used a concept mapping approach and talked about the importance and then the feasibility. And this is what the importance and feasibility came out of actually engaging older adults in this process. And you'll see, it's very hard to see, but engagement was one of the big things that came out, particularly from the older adults. They see it as both important and feasible, so they're on board. Just as an aside, one of the knowledge translation projects that we put on after this was to have a day-long seminar at one of our at Communitech, our big innovation hub, where we brought in 80 older adults. Now, I cannot tell you how interesting that was to see some of the tech and developers. They literally came down. They couldn't believe, there are people with walkers and they're in the space. We had a safari for them, so we invited a number of new companies who were developing novel technologies, and they were able to go around and talk to these developers, and the developers were able to get their responses and reactions. But it's not enough just to have them at that level. The older adults want to be involved with actually helping to develop priorities for innovation. They want to be able to help with directing where research goes so that they can actually have a voice in where public financing is going to be able to support the aging in place. Changing the research and health and aging research perspective, we as researchers oftentimes don't think about implementation, and oftentimes we are very standoffish when it comes to this idea of entrepreneurship. And fact be known, many of us will say, hey, look, I am not an entrepreneur, but, I am a researcher, I am an academic, and that's absolutely okay. But with all of the research that we do now, we have to be able to challenge ourselves to think about what is the practical application of this. Now, if you're involved with pure research, it's not necessarily where I'm going, but for those of us who are doing health services research, is what are the practical implications of this and how does it improve improve older adults' lives. So thinking about embedding some of the most successful innovation ecosystems are ones where universities have actually embedded this entrepreneurial thinking and activities into the very DNA of their university. And the University of Waterloo is probably one of our most successful universities in Canada, and it was developed in 1950 in collaboration with local industry. It has one of the biggest co-op programs, and so you have one of the things that we mention here, this idea of highly qualified personnel and students going out, being exposed to what's going on in industry. They bring ideas back. They take ideas from researchers out into the field. So it's this lovely kind of cycle that happens to be able to encourage an understanding of sort of innovative practices, both from a practical and also from a research standpoint. And then, as I talked before about allowing these 1,000 flowers to bloom, letting people just go with these novel and new ideas. Successful systems in the healthcare space also have what has been called a community of fate. And what that means is that people are understanding that where they're going together as a community. And so therefore it makes sense for people to come together and to be able to work together in order to be able to think about a shared vision for your community, thinking about using the resources you have and thinking about smart specialization, not trying to be everything, but saying, you know what, we're not going to pick winners, but we think we need to have some capacity and capability here. So in Waterloo, we have focused on ICT. That is really where we are. And now we're heading very quickly into quantum computing and AI. We've got a number of superclusters that have happened across Canada, and one of them is at the University of Waterloo around artificial intelligence. As well then, thinking about entrepreneurship training for some of our professionals as well, as I talked about before. And now, as well, the big message for industry is that it's not about business as usual any longer. Oftentimes, big organizations do what they do, and they do it well, and they keep on doing it exactly the same way until they don't do as well, and then they change. And so what we're trying to do now is think about when these large organizations, particularly in the healthcare space, how do we actually help them to disrupt and to be able to change the way that they're thinking within organizations. So inviting them into these innovation spaces, into the hubs, accelerators, and incubators, and not keeping them to the side and saying, well, you're industry, and you're going to have, you're going to try and influence this research too much. There are things that you can do to be able to ensure that they don't, but inviting them into these spaces to have these conversations is really important. And then as well, inviting these anchor companies, which are really important for supporting the local community to help them to innovate. The other thing that's really important as well is those companies want the best and the brightest. And those best and brightest oftentimes are aggregating around these innovation hubs and incubators. So finally, it's all about people. And again, people co-creating together are at the very center of our hub model. They are the center in universities with the finest minds, the best HQPs. In industry, it's all about finding leadership who are willing to collaborate and invest, governments who are willing to facilitate integration and shared visions and accessing resources, and civic groups who are interested in engaging older adults. One of the things that I do want to just talk about here is about some of our knock-on projects. So with this, we are heading now to we've conducted a review of all of the innovation hubs that are focused on healthcare around the world, and we have a map on our website where they are located. And so we'll be surveying these companies over the next year to be able to look at and better our understanding of how these are different, these entities are different, and how this life stage concept, this idea that they start, grow, develop, and mature, how that impacts on what they do and their success. We're also going to be working on with our SAM3, this innovation hub that I talked about in Ottawa, that is looking at analytics, motions, and monitoring, and looking how we can build that out to see if we can actually start to build this innovation ecosystem around health and aging in Ottawa. One of the more important things that we ran into very quickly is the absence of women in many of these innovation hubs and these innovation ecosystems. And just from a pure dynamic sense, that's not good. From an economic point of view, it's even worse, because it has very negative consequences when you have half of the population who are not engaging in this economy. 5% of Canadian companies have a tech female founder. That's abysmal. 5% of tech companies have a female founder. 13% have one female on the exec team. 53% of tech companies have no women at all on their companies. So those are small to medium-sized enterprises. And given that STEM is the gateway to really well-paying jobs any longer, it's really important that we start to look at the beginning part of that. So in our innovation systems, why is it that women are entering computing science at about the rate of 22%, math at 19%, physical sciences at about 18%, and 12% for engineering? And that's an issue. It's an issue because clearly it's not just about a numbers game. It's not that people are not smart enough. We know clearly that these regional systems are gendered. It tends to be very male dominated. And so we have got to look at how we change the language of what we're doing in those systems so that women start to identify as innovators and they start to identify and come into the system. In those ways. So we looked at a lot of issues related to, we actually had a symposium last year where we invited a number of different people to talk about this issue. And they're clearly intersectional issues. Some of those are related to family. Oftentimes you'll get women who are studying into childbearing age just at that period of time when they have to invest hours and hours into startups of company. So that can be an issue that really we've got to move the needle on that, and something that we need to be thinking about. So we've started we have a research grant which will be going at the end of this year to look at that issue. So I think I've probably done enough talking, and I would be happy to entertain any questions. As I mentioned, we have another research project where we're looking at a new tool for an online tool for early detection of mild cognitive impairment that is sort of part of our trying to become embedded in our research. But I think I will hold off on that for now. So I don't know if there are any questions or brickbats, bouquets that you want to throw around any of these ideas.
I don't have a question,
Yes.
and I thought I'd mention it maybe afterwards, but since there are not that many questions,
Yes.
I wonder if you're familiar with the movie The Intern. Because I thought that is maybe something you can use to. It's anti-stigma for aging, and it is a woman leading a startup with. It's a movie on Netflix with Anne Hathaway, Robert De Niro.
Yes. Yeah, no, that's a really actually. I forgot about that.
It's good PR, I think, for what you're trying to say.
Thank you. Yeah, I really appreciate that. Thanks very much.
I was wondering. Is this working? Yeah.
It
I was wondering whether you had considered looking at collaboration with UK small startup companies. I mean, there are some that I'm involved with. About a third of the people on those companies are women, so perhaps better place than in Canada. But I think certainly in terms of the research councils in Canada and the UK, there's a tie-up between the two countries.
Yes.
But you should consider
Thank you.
looking at collaborating with the same sort of companies in this country.
Yeah, no, and actually, I've been talking to a couple of people in Cambridge around that issue as well. So thank you very much. Yeah, it's been a really fruitful area of collaboration.
If you're interested, I can keep. I'll
Thank
give
you.
you
Yeah.
contacts.
I'd love that. Thank you very much. All right. Well, thank you so much for your time. Oh, one more. Yes.
Yeah, thanks very much. It's just really bringing two key points together. I mean, your last point's clearly referring to the lack of women in entrepreneurial, innovative kind of occupations in the private sector, where we would expect to see good innovation and a high level of awareness, if you like, of some of the gender dimensions that relate to ageing. And just I wanted to link that and perhaps invite your comments on this to just the general phenomenon which you started off with around ageism and the negative view of older people, and to signal the fact that I certainly see the phenomenon of the retirement age, and which has led to all kinds of consequences over the last, well, many decades actually, in terms of very often pushing people out of the workforce and,
Yes.
and getting people, or where older people are internalizing a view that they are no longer worthwhile, they have less to contribute and all the rest of it. And so as you start your campaign, or we start our campaign to try to encourage more women to enter or develop skills that will enable them to become entrepreneurs for the coming decades, so we ought to be doing the same for older people themselves.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you. And once again, it's, you know, when we talk about older people, it's again a very heterogeneous group. So you'll have some people who, through the ravages of a sort of disease or aging, they just quite simply are not capable. But you also have an incredibly vibrant group of people who are oftentimes quite well off, who really want to stay within the workforce, at the perhaps not full time, but certainly from the perspective of sort of having a voice and being able to be involved with things that they're interested in. I think there have been some moves afoot in different places where they're actually encouraging older adults to become entrepreneurs themselves, but oftentimes there are competing priorities at that age, and a little bit of weariness with some of the rigors that go along with entrepreneurship, and you know, I think that can be said true. That's one of the reasons why I think some women don't get into that area as well. Is oftentimes it's not that they're risk averse. It's that they have oftentimes choices of staying in work where there are pension plans and a paycheck to be able to support families, versus looking at precarious work where there is no paycheck for X number of years. So it's very intersectional. The other thing is that, you know, it's not only rare to see women in some of these, it's very rare to see women of color in different ethnicities in some of those groups as well, and with some exceptions. So I think this whole intersectionality is something that can and should be looked at. Certainly from the perspective of older adults, there is some cohorts of older adults that Shreya will talk about today, where women have taken a back seat to their partners, oftentimes related to their employment. So older adults now, women who are in the workforce, haven't necessarily been in jobs where they have had exposure to technology. They might have, but it was more from an administrative point of view, whereas their partners may have been in jobs where they were actively engaged with developing or using the technology. So, you know, as airline pilots, I think, was one that Shreya had as an example. So I think there are interesting dynamics in the older adults that we have to understand better, to understand what's needed to be able to get them to adopt and want these technologies. The issue, finally, that I would speak to is the issue of money. Is that as people go onto fixed incomes, they make very strong choices around what is a priority in their life with respect to technology. So I speak occasionally to a little community group called Bits and Bytes, and they are interested older adults in technology. And I always ask them a question at the beginning of something that I'm working on at the time. And last time I said, so, you know, how many of you have a smartphone? Every single one of them held up a smartphone. And I said, how many of you have a data plan? And half the hands went down. So they cannot afford the data plan. The smartphone is the only thing that they can get now in the marketplace that does what they want to do, but they cannot afford data plans in Canada because they are so expensive and because they represent an additional cost. And given that we are dreaming up the IoT and sensors-based technology and artificial intelligence that requires that you have access and are connected, we have to rethink that a little bit and say, okay, well, how are we going to work on delivering connectivity to these older adults? Because that's what we're going to be looking for in order to be able to keep them aging independently at home. So a long response to your question, but a really good one. Thank you very much for asking it.
Thank you, Josephine.
Thank you.
This is just a little gift from the organising committee.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I really appreciate it.
Lunch will be served from about 12:15 onwards in the library atrium. There are posters and demonstrations by OU grad students, Active Insights. And then straight after lunch, back in here, we're going to have a symposia by Tina Hurst, who's involved with Active Insights. So after lunch, if you can make your way back over here, and then we'll split up into sessions later this afternoon. Thank you.